Hello, so in this short video, I want to introduce some of the developer tools that we are going to use in this module. So let me just start up and we can head over. So I'm going to introduce there's two of them in particular, and there's one we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in just to kind of prepare you for the labs. But if we talked about the first one is Vite, right? So Vite is a scaffolding and build generator tool that we can use. It's not just used for React, but it works really well with React and TypeScript, right? So one of the really nice features that we can use with it is its development web server. And it provides auto transpilation on file transfer and live reloading. So as you will see when you do the lab, right, every time you change a little bit of code, in TSX, in TypeScript, it will transpile that like we talked about in the previous video, and then it will reload it into the browser, right? So it does this hot module replacement thing. So rebuild a component, and then it will reload the whole thing and render it into the browser for you. So really good for efficiency, and it speeds things up really well. Okay, it also has a builder built into it as well. So it will build production standard version of your app. It'll do like the whole minification and bundling of everything into JavaScript files and everything like that that goes with a build, and also the transpilation up front before that all happens. So it's really nice. Vite is a really nice tool. You'll spend a bit of time in the lab setting it up and seeing how it works. But once you've got it set up for your labs and for your work, then it'll just work away in the background for you, and you won't have much more to do, and it will do all this transpilation and live reloading for you as you develop your app as you go through. And then finally, when you want to build it, when you're happy with it, it'll do that for you as well. The lab this week will take you through all that. One that I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on now is Storybook. So you can use Storybook to develop React components in isolation from the overall React app. As you'll see, there'll be a component hierarchy in your React apps. When I'm building a React component, I can use Storybook to just build that in isolation and to get it working properly for all the different, I suppose, scenarios or states or stories that component might come across, right? So it's a development environment tool for React, developing React components. The reason it's popular and it's used a lot is one of the big selling points of React is reusability and producing reusable components. And Storybook promotes that. You can develop a catalog of components. Organizations can use Storybook to kind of have a catalog of components that the developers can kind of go through and have a look at and test for their particular applications that they might be building. So it promotes quicker development, and it kind of as I said, it isolates the component from the React app and kind of gets rid of any app-specific dependencies. So let's have a look at what Storybook and talk about what it does. You can install it. Again, in the lab, it will talk about how you can install it using npm install. And once you have Storybook, there's two aspects of it that are interesting, that we use. There's the web server, that performs live retranspilation and reloading of your components as you're developing them, which is kind of nice, right? And it also has a web browser interface that allows you to navigate through and have a look at your components and all the different components that might be in your component in your project, right? How we use it within our projects, within our React projects, is that we put a startup script in package.json file. You'll be familiar with the package.json file from previous modules. We put a Storybook script into that just starts Storybook on a particular port, and then we can access it and we can browse it using this web browser user interface. And just to show you what that web browser user interface looks like, you've got three aspects of it. Actually, there it is there, and I think I have it running in the background here. Yeah, I do. So here it is. These are this particular Storybook that I'm looking at here comes with the lab this week. So the lab has a starter project for your lab this week. This is in it, and it'll allow you to have a look at samples. So you can start up Storybook. Once you download that starter lab, you can start up Storybook in the project. And what we have here is a component catalog here. So I can see here's all the story files for each of my components. Like this is my component catalog, so this is my static component. So these are all samples that you can use. We'll talk about these later again. And then over here, we have the component rendering. So if I pick like this static component here, basic, there you go. Remember, this is like the example, the component we looked at in the previous video, the very simple one. I can have a look at what it looks like in isolation here. And this is a story. There's just one story for this, the basic story, right? So here's our component rendering section. So we have our component catalog here, component rendering here. Hope you can see my arrow here. And also down the bottom here, we have controls, right? So this is our component properties. I can change the component properties and actions, different callbacks that happen for that property as well. So this allows me to kind of essentially have a look at a component, a test component, and see how it behaves for different states or stories as I go along. So, yep, so the storybook controls, if I go back to again, that's what I was just talking, that's what we were just looking at here. So these storybook controls give you a graphical user interface to interact with a component dynamically without having to recode it down here. So I can have a look at how it will operate for different scenarios, for different states. Okay, so that's kind of good. We better have a look at the code, I suppose, and see how we can develop it, right? But before that, just to describe what a story is. Each component has several states, right? And those states can depend on various just kind of different scenarios that might occur for a story, for a component in an application, right? And each of these states is termed a story. So if we look at that languages kind of component that we were looking at so far, the list of languages, we talked about the different states that component might come in, that might occur, right? The default state might be you have 5 or less languages for the list, right? Remember that unordered list we looked at in the last video. If we have 5 or less languages, then the way we want the components to work is just we render the full list. If I just jump back into the code here, we have 5 or less, we have 2 languages here, we just render the full list here. It might be the case that we have a boundary condition, right? Another condition where, let's just say the component, there's no, we're providing no languages, no list to the component. So we just, in that case, rather than just display nothing, we want to just render no languages message in the component, right? That's another story. So we have the default story, a boundary story. Then we might have an exceptional story where we have more than 5 languages. In that case, we want to render the first 5 and then have a see more link down the bottom, right? So these stories are design considerations. You can think about that. There are different states or design considerations for this user interface component, this React component we're developing, right? And they're written in what we call component story format, or CSF. And these are functions that describe how to render the component. So let's just have a look at how that would be done in code a little bit in a second, right? So you can see here that the different stories. So say for my dynamic languages here, I have basic, boundary, and exceptional. And what might happen here is that if I click on basic, I just get the basic list. If I have boundary, it should display no more stories. And then if I click on the exceptional story here, I see a list of the first 5, and then I have a see more link here that will load the next 5 languages in the list, essentially. Okay. So the list of components, what I'm talking about here is in this dynamic languages component, I have 3 stories: basic, boundary, and exceptional. This is a list of the components, states or stories under its name. Okay, so that's how that works. All right. Also, we can define groups of components as well when the catalog is large, and this kind of helps us. I'll talk about that in a sec. It's better to just demo that. So we have group A and group B and how that's done. But let's just have a look at the code. So here's an example of a code. So if I'm writing a story, I have to write a story file, right? And a story file ends with a .stories.ts extension. That's the convention, right? And we have essentially one story file per component, and that story file can contain multiple stories. The story file itself will contain a meta object here, right? So this constant here, meta that I'm defining here, it's a type of dynamic languages. So you can see here, meta itself this meta type that I'm importing up here. Each storybook, I'm importing meta and a story object here from the storybook library, okay, React library. And the meta type, this type annotation, this kind of type of dynamic languages, it specifies that meta should conform to a meta type. So meta itself is, the meta type is generic, this one here, right? So meaning it can operate in different types of inputs. So hopefully you've covered that word with TypeScript already. But the main thing I'm supposed to describe here, format of stories is all the two things that each story file needs to have. It needs to export, the default export must be metadata about how the storybook lists the component, right? So it'll have a title, a component is associated with, and that will always be the meta itself. This type of this concept will be a type of dynamic languages. Then also it has its stories, right? There'll be named exports. So in this case, I'm exporting basic, which is the basic story. And then I have the properties of that, or data that component will use for the story, the arguments here, right? These arguments here, right? So in this case, I'm exporting basic, boundary, and exception, okay? 3 different stories, right? But let's just have a look at the code and see how I might do that in the code. So if I open up my code window here, okay, so this here, what I'm looking at here, by the way, is your starter project for your lab this week. I'm just going to get rid of that there for a sec. And let's have a look. In here, there's a load of components here, and I have some sample properties here. And one sample property here, I'm just going to use one here that I developed here. Yeah, props demo here. It's actually open here. Yeah, so I can see it here. Okay, so this is a component, a React component, a functional component. I've called it demo. Okay, I'll talk about what properties are, but what this does essentially is just will display a list of languages that I supply to this component. It will render a list of languages in an unordered list with a heading, just like the example we saw the last time, but this time it's a proper React functional component, right? So that's what this component file is exporting, export default demo, which is a React component. But this will make more sense in a while. Let's have a look at this. Let's develop a story for that. So in my stories folder here, I have some sample stories. These are the ones that you just saw in when I showed the browser interface for our stories. I've already started, by the way. I've already started Storybook here, so the web server is running, and this is the web interface I have here. And these are all the sample components, story files I have for samples for each component that I have. So I want to develop a new one here. Okay, so let's just say I want to develop a new one for this sample component that I have here. So in stories, let's create a new one. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call it demo. And remember what I said, the convention here is I ended .stories.ts, right? The convention is always to complete a stories file with a .stories.ts file, right? So do that. So now it's empty. And let's put some code in here, right? Oops, no, not that. So let's just have a look for some code here. So what I'm going to do, the imports I'm going to have for this TypeScript. So I'm going to import meta and story object. I need these from Storybook, from the Storybook React library. Okay, and also I want to import the component that I'm writing the story file about, right? The demo component. We just saw that there in components samples props demo. Okay. So first thing I want to do is define, remember what I said here, I need to define the metadata, how Storybook lists this component. And this will always be the same. I'm just going to paste this in here. So I'm going to define a concept called meta. And it's this, the type is this meta. The type is this meta type, right? Which is a generic type, which conforms to this demo component, right? So it'll operate on different types, as I said, and in this case, it's going to be used with our component. Sorry, we're jumping around there, this demo component. So I'm going to give it a title, and what I always supply in here, right, in this constant, what I'm also supplying here is a title property, this object for meta. It's going to have a title and a component that's associated with, which is the demo component that I'm writing the story about. And in this case, I'm just calling it demo component with props. Okay. So I need to export this, okay, and as my default export, right? And the story as my default export, and I will use this meta kind of object to it's going to use that to kind of list the components in Storybook. Okay, the next thing I need to do then is define the story itself. Okay, so I need to define a type story, right? New type. So what I'm doing here, right? Type story. Creating a new type alias story, right? So this the type of which is type of meta. So it is equivalent to this means whenever I use story in the code, TypeScript will treat it as a story object with type of meta, right? Which is demo component. And this format, what I'm going through here is it's going to be the same for every story you write, more or less. You're just going to be changing the component, and then when you go and write the stories and the title, but you're going to be changing the writing your own stories with the different types of arguments or properties that you're going to use. And then the next thing I want to do here is define my basic story. My basic story here are the properties. This will make more sense when I actually do I'm doing a named export here when we do component and component properties in a minute or in the next video. So look, I'm defining here some arguments here, languages and heading. The languages and heading properties here that I'm defining here, these are used by my component to display the list of, you can see here I have a list of files here, a list of languages here, and a heading ranked. What I can also do, so once I've done that, actually, that's my story complete, right? And again, the two main things are I'm exporting my metadata and I have my story here, right? If I go back and have a look at Storybook now, you can see it, right? So it's up here, demo, right? And basic, and there it is, right? Ranked languages, right? And what I can do now is I can kind of change a few things. I can either do it in the controls here. So as you see here, I supplied these properties, right? Languages and heading. Okay, if I look back at my code, look, there they are, languages and heading, ranked. Yeah, I can change this in Storybook. I can test. Let's just say change that to top, right? You can see it changes automatically. As well in languages here, what I can do here is I can add or delete. So I can remove languages to see how it behaves if I keep removing, or I can add one in as well if I want in other languages like, you know, C++, and see how it behaves, right? Save. So, you know, again, for testing and seeing how a component renders as I kind of change it, that's fine. The other thing I can do is here, say if I want to add it in another story, let's just do that here. And I'll just call this story new. Okay, and let's just change some stuff here, and I can change the type here from ranked to best languages or something like that. And let's just change some of the data here. Change that to, you know, Pascal or something like that. Let's just make sure that I haven't broken it here. There we go. So that's another new story. And if I go back into here, yeah, I can see for this component now, I have two stories, basic and new. See it? And it changes, right, based on what I have there. So that's just a very simple example. So I have two stories there written. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that in my title here, at the moment here, you can see here, this component is out on its own. But it's, as I said to you, it's kind of good if we could group components together in different categories. It helps in terms of for component catalog, so you can see samples and exercises. Let's just create a new one here, and let's call it demo. A new grouping called demo or something like that, right? So if I go up here and I think if I type in demo, it should work for me. Kind of broke it there. Bear with me 1 sec there, folks. Yep, actually, it's just reloaded there. It's just, you can see here, it's because I was looking at the old one. If I look in demo now, you see I have a new exercise samples demo. The old one is gone because I moved it into a demo, a separate grouping. And if I go back down here, it should reload nicely again. Right? So now you see I have demo, samples, and exercises, different groupings, and how I've specified that in my demo, in my storybook file. It's just demo and then /, and then I can do sub groupings as well if I want to. But that's Storybook. So that's a very simple and a very quick introduction to Storybook. The main thing here is that we have our metadata specified here, right? And also our stories here, a different story. You can define, stories are implemented as functions here, as you can see. Okay. There you go. The other thing that I wanted to kind of draw your attention, we talked about the groupings there. Yeah, we use a directory path name symbol for groupings, and that will allow us to kind of specify different groupings we want in our Storybook files. So our Storybook list of Storybook components. So that's Storybook, and you'll use Storybook in the lab this week just to explore how you can create components and have a look at how TypeScript is used as well to create components as well in TSX. And it's a nice way to introduce you to it. The next video, what we're going to do is going to move on and talk a little bit more about components, a deeper dive on